So what actually is autism? Well, you may have heard someone talking about autism spectrum disorders. This is shortened often to ASD. And the reason why we use that language is because in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the manual that's used to support people in getting diagnoses, that's what it's called. So today I'm going to shorten that to autism. We know that within autism, there are a whole range of differences that can add up to someone needing to get a diagnosis. So one of those kind of groupings of differences we call social communication differences. And this is any difference in the way that someone might engage socially that might be different from what we would expect normally. So for example, an autistic person might really struggle with turn taking in a kind of a social interchange, knowing when to talk and when not to talk. They might also find it really hard then to maintain social relationships. But then with the other domain, we're thinking a lot more about physical behaviours often. So this domain is called the restricted and repetitive interests and behaviours. And the idea is that there are interests and behaviours that are repetitive and restrictive. And again, I don't love this language, but it's the language of the DSM, so I have to use it here. So repetitive behaviours are considered to be things where there is a behaviour that is repetitive. So a common example of this would be something like flapping. But you can also have within this domain sort of the real need for routine in a really, really intense way. So that might mean you're driving to work every day and you have to take the exact route, otherwise you just really can't cope. But then also within this domain, we have this idea of a restricted interest or a special interest. And often we would see, incredible knowledge or skill or interest in, drawing something specific or being able to name all of the muscles in the human body and being fascinated by train timetables. Whilst we talk about this as a difference which might lead to an autism diagnosis, it is actually a really cool part of autism that the brain can do that and have that kind of interest. But then the third thing that I think is really important to think about when we think about what is autism is sensory differences. So sensory differences refer to the way that someone might engage with the outside world because of the way that they are receiving information from the world. Our sensory systems are used so that we can receive information from the outside world, interpret them, and then respond in an appropriate way. But we see that for autistic people, sensory systems might actually be different. So for example, in a scene, they may see tiny details rather than seeing the whole of it in one go. They also might experience differences in the way that they hear sounds. So for some autistic people, they might hear a tiny sound that really no one neurotypical could hear, but for them it sounds like a pneumatic drill and they cover their hands. So there we have an example of a sensory behaviour covering the ears with the hands that resulted from an earlier sensory difference, the idea that tiny sounds are heard as really loud sounds. But this can be across any domain of sensory difference, right? So you can have visual ones, you can have ones that relate to hearing or touch or smell, or even the sense of body and space. But the really key thing with autism as a whole is that it is on a spectrum. So the idea here is that no two autistic people are exactly alike. Everyone has a whole range of difference. And actually we see this amongst neurotypicals too, to a certain extent. We can all agree that as humans, we have a whole bunch of difference between us. No two of us is exactly the same. Well, that's the same within autism. Autism is a spectrum. So there are some people that may experience some differences in some domains and not others, and vice versa. But importantly, when you think about autism, autism isn't just what you see in a person. Sometimes autism can not look like it's there on the outside, but someone's really struggling on the inside. And so it's not always visible. And we need to be thinking about that when we're thinking about how we can support people with autism within our church.